all these slave masters posing on your dollar.
Some of y'all want to try and find political compromise with those that want to groom our school-age children and pretend men are women. I think they need to be lined up against a wall before a firing squad be sent to an early judgment. Former Mississippi House lawmaker Robert Foster. This is a tweet from a former sitting member of a state house and someone who ran for governor of Mississippi. I find it funny that he isn't talking about the massive child abuse in the church, but trans people. It is because of rhetoric like this being espoused by public servants that I decided to make this video series. I feel like we have learned nothing from our past. The same old playbook being used over and over to attack minorities in this country is getting old. While this is 2023 and it seems like we should have moved on from this ridiculous rhetoric, we have not. Even for the queer community, there is still a large swath of Americans who wish to take their rights away because they want to use their subjective morality as a bludgeon until everyone else stands in line with their worldview. They don't openly talk about these things for fear of public shaming and backlash, but they can use their political power to elect people who will. This way, they have plausible deniability. They can hide behind the notion of, well, I don't agree with all their views, but they represent me the most argument. The trans community is being targeted by so many that it is almost impossible to go over all the groups and instances in which they're being persecuted in one video. I've decided to break this video into some of the major areas in which I believe would do the best in progressing trans issues in our society today. I will focus on how politics, religion, science is used to create arguments that dehumanize trans people. In all of these areas, certain groups have tried and successfully painted trans people as not human beings, but degenerate child groomers. That they are not worthy of the same rights that all other American citizens enjoy. But why? Why is it that in the supposedly freest nation in the world, people are not allowed to be who they want to be? Why is it that the concept of an in-group versus an out-group is always the method of attack against the progression of our understanding of human identity? The power of state government. Like I mentioned before about voters having plausible deniability with their elective representatives, the power of the government is used to keep certain cultural norms in place. While the government isn't necessarily in the business of legislating morality, it does have a huge influence on the citizen's sense of morality. The unjust killing of another human being is a crime, but generally most people believe that it's just evil to do so. The citizens may have a moral argument to make unjustified killing of another a crime, but the government doesn't. The government acts in a way that should protect people's rights, not because it is right or wrong, but because it promotes a neutral state of nature for citizens to enjoy and the government's continued existence. When it comes to the many minority issues in the past, arguments made from a moral perspective have been quickly dismantled. However, the opposition has become very good at attaching a safety issue to their moral opposition. This secondary issue is what the moral issue rides upon. For example, a lot of the laws surrounding desegregation didn't have an explicit racist intent, but the outcomes were pretty clear. Things like redlining kept black people from being able to buy in certain areas to keep white families safe from black families destroying their property value. This also wasn't just white people. Many wealthy black communities also fought to keep poor blacks from their neighborhoods. The tough on crime policies enacted in the late 1980s was focused on crime. However, high crime rates just so happened to be in highly impoverished communities that were created by desegregation policies like the ghettos. Broken window policing, mandatory minimum sentencing, and the crack cocaine sentencing disparities affected black communities the most. The arguments used to enact those policies were not based on race, but the outcomes certainly obtained a racial bias that was planned. Even in the abortion debate, which had been argued in the realm of morality, recently had a Supreme Court victory that had nothing to do with morality. It went back to the argument of states' rights, which is another policy that has racial implications to skirt legislating morality. pro-life arguments are getting better at providing reasons for government protection of life at conception that are not based upon moral ones. By tying their arguments to a fetus's heartbeat or life begins at conception, they are making a right to life argument already enshrined in the Constitution. While previously their argument of abortion is wrong because my religion said so failed because the government can't necessarily legislate morality. This brings us to how the government and state power is being used to persecute trans people. However, I want to begin with a certain portion of history that people know so much about, but trans issues are completely left out of the conversation. I find it quite odd that the persecution of the LGBTQ community was completely omitted from my learning of the Holocaust in middle and high school. I remember learning a lot about Jews and Gypsies, but nothing about the treatment towards the LGBTQ community. We now go back to Magnus Hirschfeld, the Jewish doctor that created the Institute for Sexual Science in Germany. While many Germans embraced Hirschfeld's work, others found it scandalous. His work was frequently attacked in the press. Large numbers of Germans were opposed to public discussions of sex and sexuality. They viewed such debates as decadent, overly permissive, and immoral. Many were disturbed by the increased visibility of sex in advertising, film, and other aspects of daily life in the Weimar Republic. For many, Hirschfeld and his institute symbolized what they saw as Weimar's overly sexualized culture. Hirschfeld even became the victim of violent right-wing assaults during the 1920s. In 1921, he was badly beaten in Munich. A newspaper article celebrated the assault and warned that the next time his skull might be crushed. In 1933, the Nazi regime began to crack down on what they saw as un-German ideas. Hirschfeld and the Institute for Sexual Science were subject to Nazi attacks on several fronts. The Nazis hated Hirschfeld for his pacifism, his Jewish ancestry, and his ideas about sex, gender, and sexuality. On May 6, 1933, a Nazi student group marched to the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin. With members of the SA, they ransacked the institute and looted its library and archives. Days later, the stolen books, artifacts, and clinical files were destroyed in one of the several public book burnings organized across Germany. A bust of Hirschfeld was paraded through the streets on a stick before being thrown onto the bonfire. Within months, Nazi authorities forced the Institute for Sexual Science to close. The persecution of those in the LGBTQ community has been overlooked for so long that the German parliament, for the first time, dedicated its 78th annual Holocaust Memorial commemoration to the LGBTQ+ people who were killed or persecuted by the Nazis. For our remembrance culture, it's important that we tell the stories of all victims of persecution, that we make their injustice visible, that we recognize their suffering, Boss said in a speech to lawmakers to mark the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. The last survivors of this group of victims has died recently without us having listened to them. Their stories must be told by others, Boss said. 78 years it has taken the LGBTQ community to be officially recognized for their suffering under the Nazis. With everything we know about the Holocaust, this portion has been overshadowed for far too long. While the travesty of what happened to the Jewish people was much more tragic, this does not need to be a contest of who was persecuted more. The omittance of the LGBTQ+ community in this dialogue has undoubtedly led to the increased persecution of the community today. I feel as if we are all taught their stories in the same context as the Jews, then there would be much more empathy towards them. But this is how even history is politicized, which leads us into the present day. Don't say gay bills. According to the American Civil Liberties Union, there are currently 491 anti-trans bills across the country. With this many bills, you would think it's one of the most important issues in America, which is interesting since the LGBTQ community makes up 7.2% of the American population according to the most recent Gallup poll. This is up from 3.5% in 2012. Trans people make up less than 0.6% of the LGBTQ community. But this might be the reason why there's an increase of anti-trans legislation. As our society becomes more accepting and normalizes these communities, more and more people will come out of the closet, so to say. We will all see more of this community, not because individuals are being indoctrinated, but because they no longer fear consequences such as death and social isolation. indoctrination. One side believes that somehow the LGBTQ community is just ideas that are spread like a virus, that the continuing of those ideas is the reason for their increased numbers, not that these people were born that way. They see it as the ideas winning converts, like in the realm of religion, versus just our better understanding of the human condition. They want to use the power of government to ban these ideas in hopes that it will curtail the converts to the LGBTQ community and enshrine these cultural norms for future generations, which is completely counterintuitive to their religious beliefs on guns. They feel making certain guns illegal will not solve the problem because criminals do bad things. They don't see the hypocrisy here that banning trans people won't matter since trans people will do human things. One indirect way the trans community is being targeted is the teaching, or rather not teaching, of their history and existence. In a recent wave of anti-trans bills across the nation, certain states have been targeting the historical narrative to erase or minimize the teaching of who they are and to go so far as censoring how they, as people, are talked about in classrooms. In Florida, this has been introduced under the Don't Say Gay bill, which states classroom instruction by school personnel or third parties on sexual orientation or gender identity may not occur in kindergarten through grade 3, or in a manner that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate for students in accordance with state standards. Supporters of the legislation say it's meant to allow parents to determine when and in which way they introduce LGBTQ topics to their children. It also gives parents an option to sue a school district if the policy is violated, which is funny because teaching heterosexual norms are not mentioned and awfully completely overlooked. Apparently, it is appropriate to mention heterosexual relationships, mention one's spouse, and wear heterosexual symbols like wedding rings, but it's not appropriate to talk about same-sex or trans relationships. If the bill is about protecting kids from indoctrination, then the very concept of marriage violates that concept. The bigger problem lies in what the bill doesn't mention by name. When the bill first passed, it was only meant to target children up to grade 3 because this was the arbitrary line they drew in the sand of when these topics would be age appropriate. However, just like their own fear-mongering about gun control and how that would lead to a slippery slope of banning all guns eventually, Florida legislators have recently just passed an expansion of that law in the House. The rule change would ban lessons on sexual orientation and gender identity from grades 4 through 12, unless required by existing state standards or as part of reproductive health instruction that students can choose not to take. That's the time when students are becoming aware of their sexuality. So what was supposed to be just save the children from indoctrination and sexual perversion has since evolved into all topics about the LGBTQ community is just strictly off limits. I mean, the bill even bans trans students from sharing their preferred pronouns with others. Like, what the hell? Asking others to respect who you are as an individual is the foundation of what liberty is. Even as seniors in high school that can work, pay taxes, and be held accountable for their actions by law in certain extreme circumstances, are not considered mature enough to learn about health science when it comes to sexual reproduction and concepts of gender. This is the true nature of the legislation. They just want to ban the LGBTQ community by legislating it out of existence. They want to push these people back into the shadows, but they're okay with the rise in white supremacy because free speech is good. This shows what conservatives are most afraid of. The party that champions the free market of ideas is actually afraid of the free market of ideas. The thought that they cannot control how their children think and act scares them enough to legislate certain moral behaviors for everyone. This is the moral tyranny that they're so afraid of the left committing. They honestly believe that if their children do not learn about the LGBTQ community in school, that they will, 1, never become a part of that community, or 2, be so ignorant about who they are that they will continue to advocate for policies that target them. If anything, expanding this all the way through grade 12 proves they are the ones who want to indoctrinate children. They are the evil they so valiantly try to fight against. There are over 220 bills alone this year that deal with trans issues coded under schools and education. Some of them deal with the issues of teachers having to report to parents regarding things the student has spoken about. One bill in Arizona seeks that an employee or independent contractor of a school district who interacts with students shall disclose to a student's parent any information that the employee or independent contractor learns about the student as follows. For information relating to a student's gender, gender identity, gender pronouns, sexuality, sexual identity, or similar topics. The disclosure shall be made not later than 48 hours after the employee or independent contractor learns about the information. Why the hell would they have to disclose this information when concerning these topics? It's quite possible the parents don't know about these issues because that student may feel threatened if their parents did know. So they keep some of these things away from their parents to keep the peace. They must hide who they are in order to maintain a positive relationship with their parents. Where else can a child find a safe space for them to express or talk about certain things? Why does it feel like trans people will have to travel some metaphorical underground railroad just to talk about how they feel? Maybe they've brought it up to their parents and their parents dismissed them and told them it was just a phase, or that they were just full of sin and evil. And now their only safe outlet that has the potential to save their life is being invaded because we can't trust the people in our community. I don't know why any of these things must be reported to the parent, unless the whole point is indoctrination, and this provides a feedback loop to the parents to correct later. The Trevor Project has produced research that shows transgender and non-binary youth whose pronouns were respected by the people they live with were 50% less likely to attempt suicide as those whose pronouns were not respected. Other bills seek to remove certain texts from school libraries that could be used for instruction based upon a parent's request, prohibiting the teaching of gender identity before a certain grade unless otherwise required by law. A government entity may not adopt a policy requiring an employee to A. use an individual's preferred pronoun when addressing or mentioning the individual in work-related communications, or B. designate the employee's preferred pronoun in work-related communications, and a board of a school district, public school, or public school teacher may not adopt a policy that requires or prohibits any individual from using a student's preferred gender pronoun unless otherwise required by law. A school district, public school, or public school teacher may not A. adopt a policy concerning a particular student's transgender status without approval from the student's parent or legal guardian, and the list goes on and on. Government in schools. Besides trying to legislate what and how certain subjects are being taught in schools, the bathroom, locker room, and sports is another huge issue that is first being tested on children. I'll go more into this theory of mine on why Save the Children is their go-to argument for resisting cultural changes, but I'd like to focus on how government is being used in these two areas to politicize these spaces. The first major area of focus is on who may use a restroom. New bills and laws have been introduced that restrict bathrooms to assign sex at birth only, or work out a plan with the parents and the school officials on finding another place like the nurses or staff restrooms. This would require that the student's personal information to be available to those who are gatekeepers of the restrooms. What I find interesting here is that a lot of the reasons given for this type of restriction is that males cannot be trusted in these spaces. If one has a penis, then they are automatically predators or are going to do something terrible to a female with it. It seems like it's only about protection of innocent girls. I never hear anyone say, "I'm afraid a female will enter the male's restroom and do X." It's always that one day a male will just magically say, "I'm a female today," so that they can go and do naughty things in the female's restroom. It seems quite one-sided. But then again, think about the common tropes of who needs protection in society. Females are innocent and need the protection from people who want to do bad things, like black men, lesbians, and now trans women. In all honesty, we should be fixing our restrooms in general. Our restrooms add no real sense of privacy to begin with. Stalls that people can look over and under, why not just create gender-neutral bathrooms? Why, instead of needing to protect these ancient structures constructed from ignorance, do we just update them? We could have many rooms with total privacy and a shared common area to wash one's hands. When people go to concerts and outdoor events, the outhouses are generally not gender specific. So why not design outhouse type structures inside the bathroom areas already? If men just need a quick access to pee, then just have a urinal room and completely private stalls for everybody else. This is where we should be moving as a society, and I have seen a lot of new restaurants adopt these measures and there's no public outcry about it. It seems we would rather continue to harm a specific community instead of designing spaces that accommodate them, which is bullshit. Why must we always sexualize things with children? These bathroom bills don't prevent pedophiles and perverts from preying on people in restrooms. They do that anyways. Why are we not focusing on them? Oh, but wait. By purposely confiscating trans people with pedophilia, I guess they do. Why are we not more focused on preventing video voyeurism in restrooms? A simple Google search provides more cases of this than trans people sexually abusing people in restrooms. Why is there no public fear about the very real danger of being videoed while in the bathroom? Why are we so hyper-focused on trying to prevent trans people from using a certain restroom when there isn't a huge push to protect people in general in those same areas? There are more severe and credible threats to people in restrooms than trans people, but the restroom has always been a way to paint those who do not fit in societal norms like a boogeyman. The next major battle is in sports. This is such a hot topic that I really don't want to dive into it. Many bills and laws have been passed to keep trans people out of gender categories they identify with. The biggest reason is some feel there is an advantage in some circumstances against females when males transition during or after puberty. However, when I hear some of these arguments, I see the same problems even in gendered sports. Differences between size, bone density, lung capacity, and muscle mass within the same sex are just as varying. The 200-pound 15-year-old football linebacker isn't going to be a jockey rider or an Olympic swimmer. The 4'6" chess player isn't going to magically be the next LeBron James. For each sport, there's a specific body type that does extremely well no matter what sex one is. All men and women are not created equal. Even their hormone levels vary so widely, one cannot accurately say how much testosterone one needs to be considered a man or a woman. In short, it seems that it's okay if a biological male or female with freak genetics dominates a sport, even if it has nothing to do with talent and just pure genetic factors. The average weight of a football player has gone up significantly in the last 20 years. We don't tell them they can't compete because it's unfair to all the normal people, do we? So then why does it matter when issues of gender come into play? It seems just as any issue, we must always think of the helpless female that needs protecting. We are constantly bombarded with stories of trans men dominating in one tournament, but we never hear when they lose repeatedly before that. We never hear about when trans men beat cis males in competition, which happens more often than you'd think. It seems the entire issue about trans people in sports is, think about the females who can't compete. Why? We never cared about all the other females that can't compete because they're just not genetically advantageous to that sport, or the droves of females who never got a genetic variance that statistically made them 100 times better without having any actual skill. Why is it all of a sudden a problem? Didn't President Obama hit the nail on the head when he said,
"It also means pushing our children to set their sights a little bit higher. They might think they've got a pretty good jump shot or a pretty good flow, but our kids can't all aspire to be LeBron or Lil Wayne."
I think one of the major problems was having gendered sports to begin with. It has created this concrete line in our society of how competition works between the two sexes. And I'm not saying there's a genetic difference that makes one sex better at a particular sport than another. I acknowledge the science behind the differences in bodies depending on the amount of testosterone and estrogen during and after puberty has. However, this discrepancy even exists with people of the same sex. Even when we try to compare the best female team to the best male team, we keep them separate and have them compete against each other. Why? Why not mix them together? There are already inherent differences between the two teams beyond their sex. The amount of money, resources available, and types of training given varies greatly between the two already. Would this not be an advantage for one versus the other? Why should we expect an all-female team to be able to compete against an all-male team when they don't even have the same starting point? I don't believe the issue with gendered sports is a biological factor. Personally, I'm not a fan of sports, and that's my bias. But it seems the arbitrary categories we've created for competition are just that, arbitrary. The needle can be moved to allow for competition between sexes in a fair format. I know we're trying to measure one's skill against another, but skill isn't the only factor at play. I think these blanket bans of trans people in sports totally miss the entire concept of competition, that we are trying to uphold some concept of fairness that really has not been there the whole time. However, I also believe that some sports should be kept gendered until more data is available to determine what would be fair for all to compete and have equal opportunity to win. Unfortunately, sports just aren't for fun anymore. Some people rely on these to gain access to college and provide for their families, and I would like to make sure that there's enough opportunities for all to pursue their own happiness. If you take this as anti-trans, I'm sorry. Sports are a complicated subject that has largely been ignored except for the performance-enhancing drugs debate. It sucks that a lot of the unfairness inherent in sports is based on genetic differences, in which the sport itself is creating genetic variances that are advantageous to that sport. For example, the average height of an NBA player grew from 1970 to 1991 and has remained around 6'7" since. The average height for the position has grown very slowly over that same time, but the vast majority are at least over 6 foot. Centers have been around 6'10", powered forwards 6'8", small forwards 6'6", and point guards at 6'2". But men who are over 6 foot only account for less than 14% of the human population. Only 1% of US men are over 6'4". We're talking about incredibly specific genetics needed to play in the NBA. Over 99% of US males wouldn't even be able to play the sport based off of height alone. I hear no one advocating for NBA leagues based upon height categories. So naturally, the NBA is not an all-man sport to begin with, but an all-man sport who are at least 6 feet. But no one complains about fairness here. They just say basketball is in your genes or it's not. Well, why can't it be for trans men and women then? Why do we hold one category to a different standard than another? That's my whole point. The genetic differences only become a real problem when it's trans people. All in all, a lot of these bills are about trying to control the cultural shifts that are happening throughout this country. It seems like their true aim is the indoctrination of their beliefs on who is considered normal to talk about in school. Can't talk about why trans people exist or why they're different gendered people? No, that's not acceptable. It's okay to talk about one's hetero spouse or mention that one believes in God. The constant pushing of a heteronormative message has blended those concepts seamlessly into our environment, so they are no longer questioned when they're brought up. Just like the sky is blue or water is wet, these concepts just are. The real reason behind these laws is to keep the LGBTQ community from being normalized in society, to prevent them from gaining this type of invisibility. It's harder to create this in versus out group dichotomy if one side doesn't believe the other side is not normal. The denial of trans healthcare. What is interesting about this topic is that the gatekeeping to medical care isn't happening by actual physicians in this case, but politicians. The medical community has not always been good in its treatment of minorities, from gruesome experiments on enslaved people to the forced sterilizations of black women and the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study that withheld treatment from hundreds of black men for decades to let doctors track the course of the disease. It's easy to see why many minorities do not use healthcare the same way straight white people do. The existence of these disparities with blacks is only exacerbated with the LGBTQ community, from having to deal with physician religious bigotry to inadequate research in specific ailments of these communities. I don't blame why many minority communities have trust issues with the healthcare community. Even medical associations and specialty societies are hesitant to take up some of these issues because their members see them as social justice, or not in the purview of the society to advocate for because it is political. However, we're not talking about the healthcare community's inherent problems with minorities, but how the government is being used to keep trans people from being able to access life-saving medical treatment. In this conversation, politicians are using the government to overstep highly qualified medical experts to enforce their own misunderstanding and bigotry towards trans people. It is interesting that they believe in using the medical community against the LGBTQ community and children, but when it comes to using it to support them, they are suddenly up in arms about it. State houses across the country have introduced and passed bills that ban gender-affirming care, hormone therapy, and any type of gender transitioning surgeries. Many of these bills are implemented under the guise of protecting the children from evil parents and physicians who are pushing gender ideology on their children. However, it's weird that many of the bills go beyond the age of what most states considered adulthood. Nebraska adopted the Let Them Grow Act that states no healthcare practitioner shall A. perform gender-altering procedures in the state for an individual younger than 19 years of age, or B. refer an individual younger than 19 years of age for gender-altering procedures. Gender-altering procedures is described as any medical or surgical service, including without limitation, physician services, inpatient and outpatient hospital services, or prescribed drugs related to gender alteration that seeks to alter or remove physical or anatomical characteristics or features that are typical for the individual's biological sex, or 2. instill or create physiological or anatomical characteristics that resemble a sex different from the individual's biological sex, including without limitation medical services that provide puberty-blocking drugs, cross-sex hormones, or other mechanisms to promote the development of feminizing or masculinizing features in the opposite biological sex, or genital or non-genital gender-altering surgery performed for the purpose of assisting an individual with a gender alteration. What's funny about this legislation is that it states genital and non-genital gender-altering surgeries are generally not recommended for children, although evidence indicates referral for children to have such surgeries are becoming more frequent. In their own bill, they admit that these surgeries are not recommended for children and provide no evidence of this becoming more frequent. They just say that it is. This is direct evidence of lawmakers involving themselves into the patient-physician relationship without any actual knowledge of the process. They just regurgitate what they've heard on the news and run with it. The Boston Children's Hospital Center for Gender Surgery program specifically states on their website that all genital surgeries are only performed on patients age 18 and older. Seattle Children's Surgical Gender Affirmation Program states patients must be 18 or older by the time of surgery for gender-affirming genital procedures. So what do these bills aim to protect children against if only 18-year-old and above can even get this type of treatment from hospitals? Recent data from Reuters does show that gender dysphoria diagnosis in minors is on the rise. Medicaid patient data from California, Massachusetts, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Washington, and New York show a rise from about 15,000 in 2017 to 42,200 in 2022. The use of puberty blockers in the US, patients ages 6 to 17 with a prior gender dysphoria diagnosis initiating puberty blocker treatment has doubled 633 in 2017 to 1,390 in 2021. Hardly an increase, to be honest, but this data can be seen in two different perspectives. One perspective has led to the increase of these anti-trans bills. They see this increase due to the cultural environment. They see it as an ideology that is indoctrinating the youth. That is why the number is growing, and to stop it, they must take action to ban its influence. The other perspective is that because society has grown increasingly more tolerant and the science behind gender has progressed, these numbers increase to only represent what was already present in our society to begin with. Is the increase in numbers due to the acceptance of something they were born as versus something that was pushed onto them? This question is the root of the difference of perspectives. Physicians are also not immune to ideology either. I'm involved in state medical societies, and I've even heard physicians themselves tout talking points from their media sources that are inflated and exaggerated. I've heard the same physicians who are worried about scope creep have opinions in fields that they don't even practice in, especially when it comes to gender affirming care. They will testify that prepubescent children are having their perfectly good body parts chopped off when this is not even remotely close to being true. One physician going so far as to say, "I hope none of you all left your children at home unattended with cigarettes and beer to attend this conference. This just proves that we cannot trust children all the time." As if this was a metaphor to how entire teams of physicians, parents, children, and other trained professionals handle gender affirming care. Multiple states have bills that make it seem like gender affirming care is somehow experimental, with titles like Saving Adolescents from Experimentation, or that these medical professionals are abusing children with titles like Children and Adolescent Child Act and Prevention of Child Abuse. Regardless of how you feel, these bills are clear examples of politicians trying to legislate local municipalities and to practice medicine. While many of these politicians hold these beliefs sincerely and use these divisive bills to create controversy to get reelected, others just follow suit with major donors to their campaigns. Groups such as the Alliance Defending Freedom, the Family Research Council, the Liberty Council, and the American Principles Project are behind a multi-million-dollar effort to target LGBTQ rights through parents' rights bills. According to these groups of Christian activists, they aren't seeking to impose their beliefs on others. They're fighting against beliefs being imposed on them. They feel these ideas are presented to their children without their consent. I will dive into this save the children mindset in my next video, but I wanted to point to their reasoning for advocating government to pass these laws. They are trying to influence the public space that is progressing beyond their cultural values to shield their children from difficult conversations and ideas that their parents are not comfortable addressing at home. By trying to deny their children access to certain information, they are indoctrinating their children. What is interesting is they don't see the hypocrisy in their own actions. If they don't want their children to be subjected to these things, then don't send them to public schools. These spaces are not the only places for children to learn and meet federal and state requirements for the education of children. There are hundreds of private schools that will teach children limited views. Why does the public space need to teach values that go against inclusion and acceptance of the people that make up this country? Should it not be the role of public education to include how to interact and treat others in this democratic country with respect and tolerance? How the hell can our children grow up and learn how to interact with people from different beliefs if we try to exclude those very same people from the conversation? These laws are aimed at protecting an individual child, but completely disregard all other children and parents' wishes outside of that group. This is not how public spaces should work. In my opinion, learning about new concepts of gender and personal identity should be considered neutral. In the same sense that children learn about body parts, the planets, and history, these concepts should be taught. The LGBTQ community isn't going anywhere, so it makes sense for those ideas to be introduced in our public spaces, which public schools fall into. Gender is not a sexual concept in the same token that learning about sex education is. When we learn about our bodies at first, our private parts are just for going to the bathroom. The same consideration should be given with gender. Just as there are kids who like sports and wear jerseys, who like ballerinas and wear skirts, gender should be taught in that sense. It is how they would like to express themselves. It has nothing to do with sex or sexual desires at all. There is no doubt about it. These laws banning gender-affirming care and healthcare to trans people are life-threatening. Study after study have shown that access to these treatments has saved the lives of trans people and helped treat their gender dysphoria. A study posted on the National Library of Medicine titled "Suicidality Among Transgender Youth, Elucidating the Role of Interpersonal Risk Factors" found that 82% of transgender individuals have considered killing themselves and 40% have attempted suicide, with suicidality highest among transgender youth. 56% of youth reported a previous suicide attempt and 86% reported suicidality. Logistic regressions indicated that models for both lifetime suicide attempts and suicidality were significant. Interpersonal microaggressions made a unique, statistically significant contribution to lifetime suicide attempts, and emotional neglect by family approached significance. School belonging, emotional neglect by the family, and internalized self-stigma made a unique, statistically significant contribution to the past 6-month suicidality. Studies like this show that gender dysphoria isn't the cause of their suicidal thoughts, but environmental factors that influence their acceptance into society as who they are. If these lawmakers were so worried about saving the lives of children, then banning access to this care would not be on the table. By not having access to this care, these individuals must navigate their personal issues by themselves. If they have a hostile support system at home and live in areas where they face harassment or discrimination, this increases the chances of suicidal behavior and the likelihood of increased depression. Laws that prevent this type of care, no matter at what age, directly hurt trans youth. These lawmakers are using cherry-picked data points and extraordinarily rare cases of youth that regret their gender transitions to push this legislative agenda. They fundamentally don't understand gender dysphoria either. This is evident by their policies meant to block access to its treatment. They believe that suicidal thoughts from gender dysphoria are akin to depression, where the thoughts are a symptom of the ailment. They either refuse to educate themselves or voluntarily remain ignorant to push their bias. Gender dysphoria is more about that individual's environment being accepting of the way they want to live. If society was more accepting and offered more care to these individuals, then the problems with gender dysphoria would gradually decrease and save more lives. However, lawmakers' constant anti-trans language and the slew of anti-trans laws not only create an environment that exacerbates the symptoms of gender dysphoria, but they actively cause this ailment to get worse for those who suffer from it. Imagine using the government to actively cause citizens' lives to become worse because one doesn't like how they present themselves or hide behind religion to continue their bigotry. In any other case, this would be called tyranny. Left-handed persecution. Why would I be talking about left-handed people in a video about trans people? I believe that how society has historically treated left-handers is a direct mirror of how trans people are treated today. The way we treated left-handed people in the past almost seems too stupid to have ever happened. But left-handed people were persecuted from all different groups in society, all because they naturally performed tasks with their left hand versus their right. This is how they were born, and because of most of society was right-handed, many believed that left-handed people were somehow defective. During the 18th and 19th century, discrimination against left-handed people became ingrained and institutionalized. Even in the relatively free societies of North America and Western Europe, deliberate and sometimes brutal attempts to suppress left-handedness left-handedness and imposed conformity in the education system were endemic during this time, including such practices as tying a child's left hand behind his chair or corporal punishment for anyone caught writing with the left hand. Cesare Lombroso was an Italian physician in the 1800s that believed in biological determinism. He thought criminality was inherited. Through his observations of sex workers and criminals, Lombroso hypothesized a correlation between left-handedness, criminality, and degenerate behavior. He also propagated the idea that left-handedness led to other disabilities by linking left-handedness with neurodegeneration and alcoholism. Lombroso's theories were likely accepted due to the pre-existing regional stigma against left-handedness and greatly influenced the reception of left-handedness in the 20th century. His hypothesis even manifested in a new way during the 1980s and 1990s, with a series of research studies grouping left-handedness with psychiatric disorders and autoimmune diseases. In the 20th century, eminent American psychoanalyst Abram Blau was still suggesting that left-handedness was merely due to perversity and the result of emotional negativism, on a par with a child's obstinate refusal to eat everything on its plate. As adults, Blau asserted, left-handers became stubborn, rebellious, rigid, and for some reason, obsessed with cleanliness. Around the same time, the influential British educational psychologist Cyril Burt was also describing left-handers as stubborn and willful, as well as awkward and clumsy. Even as late as the 1960s and 1970s, Catholic school teachers routinely inflicted corporal punishment and psychological pressure on left-handed students, ranging from accusations of being in cahoots with the devil to bizarrely being communists. Soviet bloc countries continued to maintain strict policies against left-handedness that persisted well into the 1970s. Spain, Italy, Yugoslavia, and the Iron Curtain countries all made right-handed writing compulsory in school. In Albania, left-handedness was declared illegal and was punishable as a crime. In all aspects of society, from religious institutions, parents, and medical professionals, they propagated left-handed individuals to be this biological defect or under the influence of evil just because of how they were born. Being left-handed doesn't mean you are more prone to being a criminal, just the same as being trans doesn't mean you are more prone to mental sickness. Just the same as left-handed people experience societal influences that cause mental problems and social isolation, trans people do as well. And now that the tolerance of left-handed people has grown, it turns out more left-handed people actually exist. Rates of left-handed people have increased year over year, and while I cannot specifically say what has caused it, I can guess the increased tolerance of society and more left-handed products being available has a lot to do with it, just the same as with the increased number of the LGBTQ community. It is my hope that one day in the future, we can all look back at how society has treated trans people the same way we have with left-handed people. That society grows to accept them as different ranges of what it means to be normal human beings. Not everyone needs to be this cookie-cutter output in order for society to work and run. What we need is for our people to understand that we are all not the same, and just because some of us are different doesn't mean they are abnormal or somehow broken. We all exist as degrees of the human experience, and with this video series, I hope to put some people on that path. For some reason, we never learn from history. We never learn that treating a group of people in a certain way just because they don't fit into society's narrative of what is normal has never played out in the favor of the oppressors. From black people to gays and homosexuals, what society has considered normal has excluded others at no fault of their own, and this has caused the loss of innocent human lives. I find it funny that one side of American politics is always talking about how we should be wary of the other side wielding power because their ideology would use government power to persecute citizens, but they are the ones that consistently use government power to persecute those who are not considered a part of the in-group. Historically, they have always needed an out-group to attack to gain or maintain power. From black people to illegal immigrants to the LGBTQ community, it's a constant cycle of finding a group of people to paint as outcasts and rallying behind each other to exclude them from American society. It's almost as if to be an American, one must constantly have some group to exclude in order to legitimize being an American. Thanks guys for listening. I hope you liked the second part of this series. The third part will probably be focused on why all these things revolve around children. I haven't been able to record much because of the summer and my kids have been home, and my microphone literally will pick up a mouse fart. So I didn't have time or space to make videos or content, but I plan on continuing this. Thank you guys for all your support. I hope you like, share, and subscribe. And if you have some comments, please leave them below and let's discuss these things. Anyways, stay safe, and I hope you guys continue on surviving. Thanks.